Charlotte had never envisioned herself as Mrs. Howard. When Ethan Howard, the elusive billionaire with a cold reputation, extended his unexpected proposal, it wasn't love that tied them together, but circumstance, a contract. The wedding was a quiet affair, held in the grandeur of his family estate. There were no vows of eternal love, no whispered promises under the arch of roses. Instead, the ceremony felt more like a transaction, sealed with the cold press of Ethan's lips against hers, devoid of tenderness. That night, Ethan made the terms of their arrangement clear. Sitting across from her in the dimly lit study, he outlined the 3 rules with a precision that sent chills down Charlotte's spine. "You cannot interfere with my personal life, Charlotte," he said, his piercing gaze unwavering. "You cannot object to my choices, no matter how unconventional they may seem. And under no circumstances can you tell anyone you are my wife." Charlotte's throat tightened, but she nodded, her pride forcing her to meet his gaze. "Fine," she said softly, though every word felt like it was carving a piece out of her soul. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "In a year, this will all be over. You'll get what you need, and I'll have upheld my side of the bargain." For the first few days of their marriage, Charlotte struggled to adjust to her new life. Ethan was everything she had heard and more: intimidating, calculating, and distant. His schedule was rigid, and his demeanor towards her was polite at best, dismissive at worst. Their interactions were sparse, limited to awkward exchanges during breakfast or fleeting glimpses in the hallways. At night, the emptiness of their shared mansion weighed heavily on Charlotte. She occupied a room at the far end of the corridor, her sanctuary in the cold expanse of Ethan's world. Despite their arrangement, Charlotte couldn't help but wonder about the man behind the mask. Was there warmth hidden beneath his icy exterior, or was he truly incapable of love? Her curiosity, however, was met with a stark reminder of their reality. On the 3rd evening of their marriage, Ethan returned home late, his tie loosened and his expression tired. He found Charlotte in the kitchen, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. For a moment, their eyes met, and she thought she saw something flicker in his gaze, something vulnerable. But then, as quickly as it appeared, it vanished. "Mrs. Howard," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade, "in a year we will divorce." Charlotte flinched at his coldness, but she refused to let him see her hurt. She met his gaze, her chin held high. "I know." Ethan's lips twitched into a humorless smile. "Good, then let's not make this more complicated than it needs to be." And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving Charlotte alone in the glow of the kitchen light, her heart heavier than ever. Despite Ethan's insistence on distance, their lives inevitably began to intertwine. Charlotte's warmth and kindness were in stark contrast to Ethan's cold precision, and their differences created an unspoken tension. Charlotte found herself drawn to small details about him: the way he always loosened his tie before dinner, the way his jaw clenched when he was deep in thought, the way he always paused to greet his elderly butler, despite his otherwise curt demeanor. But just as she began to see glimpses of humanity in him, Ethan would pull away, retreating behind the fortress he had built around himself. One evening, Charlotte overheard him on the phone, his voice low and clipped. "Amber, this isn't a good time," he said, his tone exasperated. The name sent a jolt through Charlotte. She didn't need to ask who Amber was. She had heard enough whispers from the staff to piece together the story. Amber was Ethan's first love, the woman who had broken his heart and left him cold. As the conversation continued, Charlotte felt a pang of jealousy she couldn't explain. She had no claim over Ethan's heart, yet the idea of him being vulnerable to someone else stung in a way she hadn't anticipated. When he ended the call and turned to find her standing in the doorway, his expression darkened. "How much did you hear?" he asked, his voice sharp. "Enough," Charlotte replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her chest. "She's still important to you." Ethan's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing. "My personal life is none of your concern. That was part of the agreement, wasn't it?" Charlotte's chest ached at his words, but she refused to let him see her hurt. "Of course," she said coolly, turning on her heel and walking away. That night, as she lay awake in her bed, Charlotte couldn't shake the feeling that she was fighting a battle she had already lost. Days turned into weeks, and the chasm between them grew wider. Ethan buried himself in work, leaving early and returning late. Charlotte busied herself with her own projects, but the loneliness was suffocating. Despite the distance, there were moments, fleeting and unintentional, where the facade cracked. A brush of hands as they passed in the hallway. The way Ethan's gaze lingered on her when he thought she wasn't looking. The softness in his voice when he asked about her day. But just as quickly as those moments came, they were gone, replaced by the cold reality of their arrangement. One evening, as they sat across from each other at the dining table, the silence was broken by Ethan's unexpected question. "Are you happy, Charlotte?" She blinked, surprised by the vulnerability in his voice. "Why do you ask?" Ethan hesitated, his gaze fixed on his plate. "Because I don't think I've given you a reason to be." Charlotte's heart ached at his admission, but she forced herself to remain composed. "Happiness wasn't part of the deal, Ethan. We both knew what this was from the start." Ethan's lips pressed into a thin line, his expression unreadable. Maybe it should have been. For a brief moment, Charlotte thought she saw something in him, a flicker of regret, a yearning for something more. But then, as always, he retreated behind his walls, leaving her alone with her thoughts. And so, their marriage continued. A fragile dance between two broken hearts, neither willing to admit how much they needed the other. The days turned into weeks, and the invisible battle between Charlotte and Ethan grew heavier, though neither spoke of it. Their marriage, built on a foundation of convenience, had become a fragile dance of avoidance and unspoken words. Charlotte found herself caught in an emotional storm she hadn't anticipated. She had entered this arrangement with the understanding that it was transactional, nothing more. But Ethan's occasional acts of kindness, his fleeting glances that lingered too long, and the cracks in his icy demeanor left her heart yearning for something she knew she couldn't have. At the same time, Ethan was battling his own demons. Charlotte had become a constant in his life, her presence warm and grounding in a way he hadn't experienced before. But every time he felt himself softening toward her, guilt and fear pulled him back. He couldn't give her what she deserved. Not with his scars, not with his past. One evening, Charlotte found herself in the garden, seeking solace among the blooming flowers under the fading sunlight. She had always loved the garden. It was the only place in the mansion that felt alive. Ethan appeared unexpectedly, his tall figure silhouetted against the soft glow of the house lights. "It's late," he said, his voice softer than usual. "You should come inside." Charlotte didn't turn to face him. "I like it here. It's quiet." Ethan hesitated, then stepped closer. "You've been spending more time here lately." "Maybe because it's the only place I don't feel like I'm suffocating," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Ethan froze, her honesty cutting through him like a knife. "Charlotte, don't," she interrupted, finally looking at him. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Don't pretend like you care, Ethan. It's easier that way." Ethan's chest tightened as he looked at her, the weight of her pain settling heavily on his shoulders. "I never wanted this for you," he said quietly. "I thought I was doing the right thing by keeping my distance, by not making promises I couldn't keep." Charlotte's laughter was bitter. And yet here we are, a marriage in name only, with two strangers living under the same roof. For a moment, silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken truths. Then, Ethan did something he had never done before. He reached out, his hand brushing against hers. "I don't want to hurt you," he said, his voice trembling with sincerity. "But I don't know how to be what you need." Charlotte's breath hitched at the vulnerability in his voice, but she pulled her hand away, her walls firmly in place. "Then maybe you should stop trying." She turned and walked away, leaving Ethan standing alone in the garden, his heart heavier than ever. Their silent struggles seeped into every corner of their lives. At breakfast, they sat across from each other, the clinking of silverware, the only sound in the cavernous dining room. At night, they retreated to their separate rooms, their thoughts filled with everything they couldn't say. Charlotte found herself crying more often, her emotions spilling over in the quiet moments when no one was watching. She hated how much she cared, how much she wanted Ethan to see her, not as an obligation, but as someone he could love. Ethan, on the other hand, buried himself in work, hoping to drown out the turmoil in his heart. But no matter how hard he tried, Charlotte lingered in his thoughts, her laughter, her defiance, her quiet strength. The house staff noticed the tension, their whispers filling the halls. "Poor Mrs. Howard," one maid murmured. "She deserves better." "Do you think Mr. Howard even cares?" another replied. Ethan overheard the conversation one afternoon, and the words struck a nerve. Did he care? The answer should have been simple. But every time he saw Charlotte's pain, every time he caught her wiping away a stray tear when she thought no one was looking, he felt a pang of regret that he couldn't ignore. The silent struggle finally reached its breaking point one rainy evening. Ethan arrived home late, drenched from the storm, only to find Charlotte waiting for him in the foyer. "You're late," she said, her voice steady, but her eyes betraying her concern. Ethan shrugged off his coat, his expression guarded. "There was a meeting. It ran over." Charlotte crossed her arms, her gaze piercing. "That's all you ever say, Ethan. Work ran over. It's not a good time. When will you stop using your work as an excuse to avoid me?" Ethan's eyes widened in surprise, her boldness catching him off guard. "I'm not avoiding you," he said defensively. "Yes, you are," she shot back, her voice rising. "You've been avoiding me since the day we got married, and I've let you because I thought that's what you wanted. But I can't keep living like this, Ethan. I can't keep pretending that we don't matter." Ethan stared at her, his heart pounding in his chest. For the first time, he couldn't find the words to deflect her accusations, because deep down, he knew she was right. "I never wanted to hurt you," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Charlotte's shoulders sagged, her tears falling freely now. "Then why do you keep doing it?" Ethan took a step closer, his hands trembling. "Because I don't know how to stop, because I'm scared of what this means, of what I might lose." Charlotte's breath hitched at his confession, her heart aching at the rawness in his voice. But before she could respond, Ethan turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the foyer, the storm outside mirroring the turmoil in her heart. Few weeks had gone by since Charlotte confronted Ethan. The evening air was suffocatingly still when Ethan walked into the mansion, his usual air of indifference replaced by a strange tension. Charlotte, who had been quietly reading in the living room, looked up, startled. Ethan wasn't alone. Walking beside him was a woman whose presence lit up the room with effortless elegance. Her name spilled from the staff's lips in hushed tones: Amber Monroe. Amber Monroe, the woman Charlotte had read about in tabloids, the one tied to Ethan's past in a way Charlotte could never compete with. Amber had it all: beauty, charm, and history with Ethan. She was everything Charlotte wasn't. Charlotte's heart clenched as Ethan's gaze lingered on Amber, a softness there that he'd never shown her. It was as if the invisible walls he always kept around himself had come tumbling down in Amber's presence. "Amber will be staying for a while," Ethan announced nonchalantly, his tone dismissive. Charlotte felt the words pierce through her chest. She wanted to object, to ask what Amber's presence meant, but she knew her place. "You cannot interfere in my personal life." Those words echoed in her mind, holding her tongue hostage. The days that followed were unbearable. Amber made herself at home in the mansion, her laughter ringing out as she and Ethan reminisced about old times. One evening, Charlotte walked into the dining room to find Amber seated at the head of the table, the spot that had always been hers. Ethan didn't seem to notice, or maybe he didn't care. "Charlotte," Amber said with a saccharine smile, "Ethan tells me you're quite the homemaker. How quaint." The condescension was clear, but Charlotte refused to rise to the bait. "I do my best," she replied calmly, though her hands trembled as she poured herself a glass of water. Ethan watched the exchange in silence, his expression unreadable. But the sting of his indifference was worse than Amber's calculated jabs. Later that night, Charlotte overheard them in Ethan's study. Amber's voice was low and intimate, weaving memories of their past together. "Ethan," she murmured, "don't you miss what we had? I've never stopped thinking about you." Charlotte stood frozen outside the door, her chest tightening with each word. She heard Ethan's sigh, then his reply, "Amber, it's complicated." The vague response tore at her. Complicated? Was that all their marriage was to him? A complication? A week later, the situation reached its boiling point. Charlotte walked into the garden and found Ethan and Amber sitting beneath the gazebo, their heads close together. Amber laughed, her hand resting lightly on Ethan's arm. The sight was too much. Charlotte turned to leave, but Amber's voice stopped her. "Charlotte, darling," she called, her tone dripping with false sweetness. "You should join us. Ethan was just telling me how much he's missed our late-night talks." Charlotte clenched her fists, willing herself to remain composed. "I wouldn't want to intrude," she said, forcing a smile. Amber's laughter was light but sharp, like a dagger wrapped in silk. "Intrude? Oh, don't be silly. You're his wife, after all, for now." Ethan's eyes flicked to Charlotte, but he said nothing. His silence was deafening. Charlotte swallowed her pride and walked away, her heart shattering with each step. That night, she locked herself in her room and cried for hours, the weight of her situation finally breaking her. The next morning, Charlotte made her decision. She spent the day preparing the divorce papers, pouring every ounce of her pain into the act. By evening, she stood before Ethan in his study, the document in hand. "She's back," Charlotte said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "I'm returning your freedom." Ethan stared at her, taken aback. For a moment, he seemed at a loss for words. Then his lips curved into a cold smile. "You think it's that simple, Charlotte?" "It has to be," she replied, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I can't compete with her, Ethan. I won't." Ethan rose from his chair, his expression darkening. "You think this is about competition? About Amber? Isn't it?" she shot back, her voice trembling with anger. "She's the one you want. She always has been. I'm just a placeholder, a convenience." Ethan's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. For a moment, it looked like he might say something, but then Amber appeared in the doorway, her presence a cruel reminder of everything Charlotte had lost, or never had. "Is everything all right?" Amber asked, her gaze flicking between them. Charlotte took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. She handed the papers to Ethan and turned to leave. "Goodbye, Ethan." But before she could take another step, his voice stopped her. "Charlotte," he said, his tone laced with something unfamiliar, desperation. "You even have our child now. Where do you think you're going?" Charlotte froze, her heart pounding in her chest. "What are you talking about?" Ethan stepped closer, his eyes locked on hers. "You're pregnant, Charlotte. I had the doctor's report." Amber's smile faltered as she processed his words, her confidence wavering. But Charlotte couldn't focus on that. Her world was spinning. She was pregnant, and Ethan had known before she did. "You've known this whole time?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan nodded, his expression softening for the first time. "And I won't let you leave, Charlotte. Not now. Not ever." Amber's presence suddenly felt inconsequential, a shadow compared to the magnitude of what had just unfolded. For the first time, Ethan looked at Charlotte as if she was the only one in the room. But Charlotte wasn't ready to forgive or forget. "You don't get to trap me, Ethan," she said, her voice fierce despite the tears streaming down her face. "You don't get to decide when I matter to you." Ethan took a step back, his confidence faltering. For the first time, he realized that winning Charlotte back might be the hardest battle of his life. The revelation of her pregnancy sent shockwaves through Charlotte's life, but the storm was only beginning. The days that followed were a whirlwind of confusion and pain. Ethan's behavior shifted dramatically. He became attentive in ways that felt foreign to Charlotte, almost unsettling. He started showing up for meals, ensuring she had everything she needed. He even attended her doctor's appointments, sitting stiffly in the corner as the doctor spoke. To anyone watching, it might have seemed like he cared. But Charlotte couldn't shake the feeling that his actions weren't born out of love, but obligation. One evening, as she sat in the nursery she had painstakingly decorated, Ethan entered without knocking. She looked up, startled, as he leaned against the doorway, his gaze sweeping over the room. "You've done a good job," he said, his tone oddly soft. Charlotte set down the stuffed bear she was holding. "Is there something you need, Ethan?" He hesitated, a rare vulnerability flickering across his face. "I wanted to check on you, and I wanted to apologize." "For what?" she asked, her voice sharp. "For bringing your ex into our home? For making me feel invisible? Or for trapping me in this marriage when you don't even love me?" Ethan flinched, but he didn't back down. "For all of it. For everything." Charlotte's laugh was bitter. "Apologies don't erase the damage, Ethan. You don't get to swoop in and act like the hero now, not after everything you've put me through." He stepped closer, his eyes darkening with something she couldn't quite place. I'm not trying to erase anything, Charlotte. I'm trying to fix it. Why now? She demanded, her voice breaking. Because of the baby? Because you think you can control me with this? Ethan's jaw tightened. Because I realized I've been a fool. Before Charlotte could respond, the sound of heels clicking against the marble floor echoed through the mansion. Amber's voice rang out, calling for Ethan. He turned toward the door, his face hardening. Charlotte saw the shift in him, the way he closed himself off at the mere sound of Amber's voice. Still running to her, I see, Charlotte said coldly. Some things never change. Ethan's expression softened, but before he could speak, Amber appeared in the doorway, her perfect smile faltering as she took in the scene. Her eyes flicked between them, landing on the baby items scattered around the room. Planning for the baby, I see, Amber said, her tone laced with thinly veiled disdain. How? Domestic. Charlotte rose from her seat, her hand instinctively resting on her belly. What do you want, Amber? Amber smirked, stepping further into the room. I came to see Ethan, of course. We were in the middle of something before you interrupted with this situation. Charlotte's blood boiled. She opened her mouth to respond, but Ethan's voice cut through the tension like a blade. That's enough, Amber. Amber blinked, clearly taken aback. Excuse me? Ethan stepped between the two women, his gaze fixed on Amber. This is my home, and Charlotte is my wife. You've overstayed your welcome. Charlotte's breath caught. For the first time, Ethan had chosen her. At least, it seemed that way. But the moment felt too good to be true. Amber's composure cracked, her voice rising. You're seriously throwing me out for her? After everything we've been through? Ethan didn't waver. Yes, I am. Amber turned to Charlotte, her eyes blazing. Enjoy your victory, Mrs. Howard, but don't think for a second this is over. With that, she stormed out, her heels clicking furiously against the floor. The silence that followed was deafening. Charlotte stared at Ethan, her emotions a chaotic mix of relief, anger, and disbelief. Why did you do that? She asked finally. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. Because she doesn't belong here. You do. Charlotte shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. Ethan, you can't just say things like that and expect me to believe you. You've spent our entire marriage treating me like an outsider. What's changed? He hesitated, his expression torn. I don't know, he admitted, but when I think about losing you, about losing our child, it terrifies me. Charlotte's heart ached at his words, but she couldn't let herself believe them. Not yet. Terrified or not, Ethan, you have to earn my trust back. I won't stay in a marriage built on lies and convenience. Ethan nodded, his jaw set. Then I'll earn it. Whatever it takes, Charlotte, I'll prove to you that I'm not the man I was. But Charlotte wasn't sure if she could believe him or if she wanted to. Amber's parting words echoed in her mind, a chilling reminder that the battle wasn't over. As the days passed, Ethan tried to keep his promise. He became more present, more attentive, but Amber's shadow loomed over them. Whispers of her return to the city and her lingering connection to Ethan followed Charlotte everywhere she went. And then, one fateful evening, a package arrived. Inside was a series of photographs. Amber and Ethan together, the dates stamped mere weeks before their wedding. Charlotte's hands trembled as she stared at the images. Her worst fears had been confirmed. When Ethan walked into the room moments later, she threw the photos at him, her voice shaking with rage. What is this, Ethan? Were you with her while we were planning our wedding? While I was signing my life away to you? Ethan's face paled as he picked up the photographs. Charlotte, this isn't what it looks like. Don't lie to me, she screamed, her voice cracking. You promised to prove yourself, and this is what I get. Ethan took a step toward her, his hands raised in surrender. Let me explain. But Charlotte was done listening. I'll give you 1 year, Ethan. 1 year to prove that I matter to you. If you can't, I'm walking away, for good this time. Ethan nodded, determination burning in his eyes. Then 1 year is all I need. But even as he said the words, Charlotte couldn't help but wonder if they were already doomed. The tension between Charlotte and Ethan reached a fever pitch in the days following her ultimatum. Despite his promises to prove himself, the scars of their past loomed large, casting shadows over every interaction. One evening, the storm outside mirrored the one brewing inside the mansion. Rain pelted the windows as thunder rumbled in the distance. Charlotte stood in the living room, staring at the divorce papers she had prepared weeks ago. The edges were crumpled, worn from the number of times she had picked them up, debated, and ultimately set them aside. Ethan walked in, his suit damp from the rain. His hair was tousled, and his tie hung loosely around his neck, but his eyes were sharp and focused as they landed on her. "Are those the divorce papers again?" he asked, his voice a mix of frustration and exhaustion. Charlotte turned to him, her eyes filled with defiance. "Yes, just because I gave you a year doesn't mean I've forgotten why I needed these in the first place." Ethan stepped closer, his presence commanding yet restrained. "Do you think I've forgotten either? Every day I wake up knowing I have to fight for you, for us. And every day you look at me like I'm already the villain of your story." Charlotte's voice broke as she responded. "Because you are, Ethan. You brought your old flame into our home, treated me like I was invisible, and now you expect me to believe that you've changed overnight?" Ethan's fists clenched at his sides, his composure cracking. "I never said it would be easy, Charlotte, but damn it, I'm trying. You want me to prove myself, but you've already decided I'll fail." Tears welled in Charlotte's eyes as she took a shaky step back. "Because you've given me no reason to hope, Ethan. You don't know what it's like to love someone who looks right through you, to feel like nothing more than an obligation." Her words hit him like a blow. Ethan closed the distance between them, his voice trembling with emotion. "And you don't know what it's like to wake up one day and realize you've spent years running from the one thing that could make you whole. I didn't marry you because I loved you, Charlotte, but somewhere along the way, I started to." Charlotte's breath caught, her heart pounding in her chest. "Don't say things you don't mean," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm outside. Ethan reached out, his hand hovering near hers but not quite touching. "I've never meant anything more in my life," he said, his voice raw. "You've shown me what it means to care, to fight for something real. I know I've made mistakes, unforgivable ones, but if there's even a sliver of a chance for us, I won't let it go." Charlotte pulled her hand away, her tears falling freely now. "It's not that simple, Ethan. Love isn't enough. Trust has to come first, and you shattered mine." The words hung heavy in the air, cutting deeper than any argument they had ever had. Ethan stepped back, his face etched with pain. "Then tell me what to do," he said, his voice breaking. "Tell me how to fix this, and I'll do it." Charlotte shook her head, her voice trembling. "I can't tell you, Ethan. This isn't something you can fix with grand gestures or pretty words. It has to come from you, genuinely, selflessly. And until I see that, I can't let myself believe in us." Ethan's shoulders sagged, the weight of her words sinking in. "So what? We just exist like this? In this limbo where I'm trying, and you're waiting for me to fail?" Charlotte's silence was his answer, and it gutted him. The stalemate between them lasted for days, the tension growing unbearable. And then came the gala, a charity event Ethan had promised to attend. Charlotte, ever the dutiful wife, agreed to accompany him, despite the turmoil between them. The event was a glittering affair, full of socialites and business magnates. But Charlotte felt like an outsider, standing beside Ethan as he navigated the crowd with practiced ease. Amber was there, of course, her presence a reminder of everything Charlotte was fighting against. She approached them with a smug smile, her eyes glinting with mischief. "Ethan," Amber purred, ignoring Charlotte entirely. "You look as handsome as ever. I was hoping we could catch up." Ethan's jaw tightened, his gaze flicking to Charlotte. "I'm here with my wife," he said firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. Amber's smile faltered, but she quickly recovered. "Of course, but if you ever want to reminisce, you know where to find me." She sauntered away, leaving an uncomfortable silence in her wake. Charlotte turned to Ethan, her expression unreadable. "Why didn't you go with her?" she asked, her voice low. Ethan's eyes locked on hers, his expression serious. "Because she doesn't matter to me anymore. You do." Charlotte wanted to believe him, but the scars on her heart were still too fresh. Actions speak louder than words, Ethan. And words, they're easy to say. As the night wore on, the tension between them reached its peak. Back in the car on the way home, the silence was suffocating. Finally, Ethan couldn't take it anymore. "I don't know how to do this, Charlotte." he admitted, his voice heavy with frustration. "I don't know how to make you see that I'm serious." Charlotte turned to him, her own emotions boiling over. "Then stop trying to control everything. Stop pretending like you have all the answers and just be honest with me. Let me see the real you, Ethan, not the man you think I want." Ethan's hands tightened on the steering wheel as he pulled over to the side of the road. Rain poured down, the sound deafening against the car's roof. He turned to her, his face stripped of all its usual confidence. "The real me is scared, Charlotte, scared that I've already lost you, scared that no matter what I do, I'll never be enough for you. That's the truth." Charlotte's breath hitched at his confession, her heart breaking for the man who had always seemed so invincible. For the first time she saw him, not as the cold, distant husband she had married, but as a man who was trying, who was struggling, and who was, perhaps, worth fighting for. Tears filled her eyes as she reached out, her hand covering his. "Ethan, I don't know if we can fix this, but maybe, just maybe, we can try." Ethan's grip tightened around her hand, hope flickering in his eyes for the first time. "That's all I'm asking for." And in that moment, amidst the storm, they began to fight not against each other, but for each other, for the fragile, precious love they had both been too afraid to admit they wanted. Months of tension, misunderstandings, and fragile attempts at reconciliation came to a head in the most unexpected way. Ethan had been trying, harder than Charlotte ever thought possible, to rebuild what they had never truly started. But despite his efforts, the cracks in their relationship seemed insurmountable. The baby's impending arrival only heightened the stakes. Charlotte's walls remained firmly in place, and Ethan's patience was running thin. He had been holding on to hope, but hope alone wasn't enough anymore. It all came to a boiling point on a cold winter night, just weeks before her due date. Charlotte had spent the evening at her mother's house, seeking solace in familiar arms. When she returned to the mansion, the sight of Amber waiting in the living room sent her spiraling into despair. Amber's smirk was venomous as she rose from the couch, a glass of wine in her hand. "Charlotte," she drawled, "good to see you. Ethan and I were just reminiscing. Old times, you know." Charlotte's eyes narrowed as she set her bag down, her voice cold and steady. "What are you doing here, Amber?" Amber tilted her head, feigning innocence. "Oh, Ethan invited me. He said it's important to maintain old connections, especially ones that were intimate." Before Charlotte could respond, Ethan walked into the room, his tie loosened and his expression grim. He froze when he saw her, a mix of guilt and frustration flashing across his face. "Amber was just leaving," he said firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. Amber's eyes sparkled with mock hurt. "Really, Ethan? After everything we talked about?" "Now," he repeated, his voice steel. Amber sighed dramatically, setting her glass down on the coffee table. "Fine, but don't say I didn't warn you, Ethan. Some things are worth fighting for, and others aren't." She sauntered out, leaving the air thick with tension. The moment the door clicked shut behind Amber, Charlotte turned to Ethan, her fury barely contained. "You invited her here? After everything we've been through? After everything I've been through?" Ethan ran a hand through his hair, his frustration palpable. "It wasn't like that, Charlotte. She showed up unannounced, and I told her to leave." "Don't lie to me," Charlotte shouted, her voice cracking. She knew too much. She wasn't here for a casual visit, Ethan. She was here to gloat, to rub it in my face that she still has a place in your life. Ethan stepped closer, his own anger flaring. "She doesn't have a place in my life, Charlotte. The only reason I let her in was to put an end to this once and for all. I wanted to make it clear that she means nothing to me." Charlotte's laughter was bitter, her tears spilling over. "And you thought the best way to do that was to invite her into our home? To let her sit on our couch, drink our wine, and spew her poison? You're unbelievable, Ethan." Ethan's voice dropped, his frustration giving way to desperation. "I don't know what else to do, Charlotte. I've been trying to prove myself to you for months, and no matter what I do, it's never enough." "Because you're still lying," she screamed, her voice breaking. "You're still hiding behind excuses and half-truths. You're still putting her needs, her feelings, above mine." Ethan's jaw tightened, his eyes blazing with emotion. "That's not true. You're the one I'm fighting for, Charlotte. You're the one I—" He stopped himself, the words hanging heavy in the air. Charlotte's breath caught, her heart pounding in her chest. "Say it," she demanded, her voice trembling. "If you really mean it, say it." Ethan took a step closer, his eyes locked on hers. "I love you, Charlotte," he said, his voice raw and unguarded. "I've loved you for longer than I've been willing to admit, even to myself. And if I've failed to show it, then I'll spend the rest of my life making it right." Charlotte's tears fell freely as she stared at him, her walls threatening to crumble. "Love isn't enough, Ethan," she whispered. "Not after everything we've been through. Not after everything we've been through. Not after everything you've done." Ethan reached for her, his hands trembling. "Then tell me how to fix it. Tell me what I need to do to make you believe me." Charlotte shook her head, stepping back. "You can't just fix this, Ethan. Trust takes time. And right now, I don't know if I have any left to give you." Ethan's expression shattered, his voice breaking. "You can't mean that. Charlotte, please, don't walk away. Don't give up on us." Charlotte's voice was barely audible as she responded. "I'm not giving up, Ethan. I'm just letting go. You need to figure out who you are without Amber, without this mess. And I need to figure out if I can ever forgive you." She turned to leave, her heart breaking with every step. But before she reached the door, Ethan called out, his voice desperate. "Charlotte, wait." She paused, her hand on the doorknob, but she didn't turn around. "I know I don't deserve it," he said, his voice trembling. "But if there's even the smallest part of you that still believes in us, please, don't let this be the end." Charlotte closed her eyes, her tears falling silently. Without another word, she walked out, leaving Ethan standing alone in the emptiness of their home. That night, as the storm raged outside, Ethan sat in the nursery, surrounded by the remnants of the life he was trying to build. The stuffed animals, the tiny clothes, the crib he had assembled with his own hands, they were all reminders of what he stood to lose. And for the first time in his life, Ethan Howard wept. Not out of frustration or anger, but out of the pure, unrelenting pain of a man who had finally realized what it meant to love and to lose. But even as the tears fell, a spark of determination burned within him. He wasn't ready to give up. Not on Charlotte, not on their family. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, there was hope. Charlotte didn't trust Ethan completely, but she saw a glimmer of sincerity in his eyes. And for the sake of their unborn child, she decided to give him one last chance. In the end, their marriage wasn't about contracts or conditions. It was about two broken souls finding their way to each other, learning that love wasn't about perfection, but about persistence. And so, Mrs. Howard stayed, not because she was bound, but because she finally believed she could be free in his arms. Tell us what you think Ethan should do to gain Charlotte's trust. Like, share, and subscribe for more romantic stories.